My name is Jackie Moulton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real-life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Moulton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. The case I'm reinvestigating today unfolded in 1973 when the South Wales community of Port Talbot was rocked by a series of violent murders. A serial killer was on the loose, targeting girls who had hitched a ride whilst returning home from a night on the town. Joseph Kappen was a serial killer and known as the Saturday Night Strangler. This whole community in Port Talbot lived in fear, absolute fear, for many, many years. I'm going to ring Phil Rees, a detective investigating the murders of Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. It was reinvestigated in the beginning of 2000. That was 27 years after the original murders. What's fascinating about this case, it was one of the first cases in its time for a man to be convicted on familial DNA and the exhumation of a body and the DNA profiling, which was 100% correct, that Joseph Kappen was a serial killer and known as the Saturday Night Strangler. I'm always intrigued by the idea that justice never sleeps. The drive by a detective to find a killer can, in some cases, span a generation and even an entire career. Detective Phil Rees was one such detective who would find himself working on the case on two separate occasions, separated by almost 3 decades. Oh, Phil, it's a quick call. It's from Jackie Moulton, ex-detective from the Metropolitan Police. We're looking at the Joseph Kappen case, and I know that you were involved in this.
Yes.
Just tell me, what do you find so interesting about this case?
It's been a case which has lingered with the people of South Wales for 27 years. I joined the South Wales Police Service in February 1973.
After doing my training, I was then stationed at Swansea Central Police Station. I became aware of most certainly the murder of Sandra Newton, which occurred in July 73.
On the 17th of July 1973, Sandra Newton's body is found by a man walking his dog in Llandarcy woods near Neath. She had been strangled with her own skirt and had a large bruise on her jaw.
Then some 6 weeks later obviously the murders of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd.
Geraldine and Pauline's bodies were found close together in a small wooded copse only a short distance from where Sandra's body had lain. They too had been beaten and showed signs of sexual assault. Can you give me an indication how large that investigation was in the 1970s?
It was a huge undertaking. I think there must have been hundreds of detectives involved at that particular time.
An enormous manhunt for the killer was launched, unlike anything ever seen in the region before or since. Despite the huge amount of manpower deployed to find the serial killer, he was never caught, and gradually the investigation was wound down. When were you later to revisit the investigation of these murders?
27 years later, really, in the year 2000, I received a phone call from DS Paul Bethel, who was part of the major crime team at the time. Basically, he stated that they were going to look into the murders of the 3 girls, and would I be interested in coming on board? The essence of the inquiry was to look into every piece of evidence relating to the murders with a view of doing some DNA work and establishing, in fact, who had killed the 3 girls. The operation name was Operation Magnum, which sounds very grand, but in fact there's only 3 of us attached to Operation Magnum: myself, Detective Constable Geraint Bale, and Paul himself. When we looked into the investigation the second time, there was some 30,000 nominal cards in the system. Nominal cards were made out every time a person was spoken to.
So, Phil, you get to number 299 of the DNA swabs. Who's number 300?
A person by the name of Joseph Kappen.
Do you remember why Kappen got selected and put in that list?
I remember personally taking Kappen's name out. He didn't stand out much more than anybody else, but it was something inside me triggered, we need to speak to him. He would have been around the right age group. He was the owner of a white-coloured 1100 and was now living in the Baglan area, which is not far from Neath.
In the original investigation, Kappen had been seen by the police because he owned a Morris 1100, and when the police saw him, apparently the car was off the road, had been loaded on bricks, and his wife had also corroborated his alibi at being his Pigeon Fancies Club. So your intuition, your copper's nose, if you like, puts him back into that system.
Yes. So I went to the address in Baglan, knocked the door. Obviously, a lady answered. She stated that she was the wife of Joseph Kappen, but in fact, Kappen had died some 11 years prior to our visit. She said that she was his second wife. And at the time of the murders, he was living with his first wife in the Sandfields area. Obviously, we checked with the births and deaths officers and confirmed that he was dead. And then, literally, we just put his name one side into what we call a dead pool. There was a few people there who had been dead, who would be obviously died since the initial investigation. So we just set him one side.
Hitting the road and driving through the streets of Port Talbot, it's astonishing looking round to think that Joseph Kappen lived and worked here, hiding in plain sight. All whilst one of the biggest police inquiries of the day tried to find the killer of 3 innocent young women. Cold case reviews, revisiting cases using DNA, have led to some truly dramatic breakthroughs. But in increasingly cash-strapped times, cold cases don't come without their criticisms, even from within the police. Some police officers might be really cynical and say, oh, there you go, then he's kind of swanning it out on a cold case review, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. But, you know, it's not about that. It was about their tenacity, their dedication, their commitment. They wanted to get this case solved, and they worked for a fantastic boss, Paul Bethel. Fantastic reputation Paul Bethel's got. And it's Paul Bethel I'm on my way to meet now. He's somewhat of a legend in police circles, having run South Wales Cold Case Unit for almost a decade.
Hi Paul, Jackie Moulton here. I'm a former DCI with the Met, and I'm looking back at the Saturday night Strangler. Phil Rees has told me about your work on Operation Magnum.
Hi Jackie. Yes, the Kappen case was a huge case for South Wales, one of the biggest cases we've had over the years.
I'd only been on the department a few months when, of course, the dreadful murders of Geraldine and Pauline occurred in September of 1973.
What leads did you have in 1973 about any possible suspects?
The finest description we had was from a gentleman who was travelling in a vehicle behind Kappen's 1100. At the time, he picked Geraldine and Pauline up on the Kingsway in Swansea. He describes a car pulling up at the lights and two young girls hitchhiking, and the driver leaning across and opening the door, and the two girls speaking to the driver and smiling. They may have known him. And he described the man as having very bushy hair and a thick moustache.
The murder of Sandra Newton wasn't linked to the two murders of the other girls. Why was that?
In 1973, when Sandra was killed, the thoughts were because of her relationship with her boyfriend at the time and the fact that they'd argued on the night, it was felt that he was probably the killer. And it has to be said that had it not been for the murders of Geraldine and Pauline 6 weeks later, which actually put a stop, in a bizarre way, to the investigation into Sandra's murder, her boyfriend may well have been arrested and charged, and we could have had another miscarriage of justice.
So 27 years later, had it not been for the DNA, I'm sure the cases would be still sitting on a shelf collecting dust.
Absolutely. Of course, in 1984, you had that fantastic development by Sir Alec Jeffreys with the advent of DNA. It was some time before we picked up on the opportunities that were really there for us.
But the good thing about it is that all the DNA samples taken from 3 murders had been safely stored.
Yes, and you know, I've said that many times. There were many, many things back in the 60s and 70s that we didn't do as well as we could have, although it's fair to say that we did our best. But I'm always grateful for the work the scientists did in 1973, and had they not carried out such a professional work and recovered all those samples, etc., we probably wouldn't be where we are today.
It was the incredible foresight of both the police and what was then the Forensic Science Unit to maintain the samples properly that would eventually lead authorities to Joseph Kappen. They really were ahead of their time. When you look back at the days of when I joined the job in the 1970s, you know, no mobile phones, no CCTVs, they had nothing, and, you know, it was a hard slog. And Joseph Kappen case is just an ideal example of the hard slog that detectives, they had 35,000 people as suspects. They had the Port Talbot steelworks, there was the construction of the new M4 motorway, transient population, and, you know, I think South Wales Police just did this phenomenal job preserving the evidence. I'm going to meet Colin Dark, the former head of the Welsh Forensic Science Service, who led the charge to solve the case through science.
Hi, Colin. Jackie Moulton here, former DCI with the Met. I'm looking back at the Joseph Kappen case. I'd be very grateful to meet you to find out how your groundbreaking DNA research on the case turned it around.
Yes, hi Jackie. We were able to apply the very latest techniques to that cold case with very surprising results.
It's been absolutely tremendous, the work we can do now with cold cases, looking at cases from many, many years old, from the 70s, 80s, with modern techniques. We can catch the person who's done it.
We want to talk about the murders of 3 girls in the area of Port Talbot in South Wales. One of them in 1973, Sandra Newton. And 2 months later, 2 young girls were murdered together, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. And DNA samples were taken from them. And it was quite unusual, I think, to be fair to say, that South Wales Police had, in fact, retained those exhibits intact from 1973.
That's right. The South Wales Police were fortunate with that the Bridge End site is an old South Wales airfield, which had a lot of bunkers and storage areas. So when the lab in 1973 sent the items back to them, they were able to store them. DNA had come into forensic casework in 1988, and there'd been some success with old cases. It was decided to try the 1973 case, the 2 girls, to see if we could get a profile. The problem then was it was a mixture. We knew that we would have the offender's DNA, we had the 2 girls' DNA in their individual stains. But I knew that a more sensitive version of DNA profiling was coming, so I stored all the samples in a freezer and waited.
And what was this new technique?
It's called DNA amplification. It's a bit like a chemical photocopier. So you've got the target DNA that you want, but it's not enough for the test until you photocopy it, amplify it, so you've got enough DNA to run the test and get you the profile.
So you had to create a profile of the girl's DNA?
Yes, with the girl's DNA, we had to find a way of getting their profile, because obviously the samples, if it was a modern case, we would have a living victim, or if it was a deceased victim, we would have fresh samples available to us.
And how did you get their profile?
Geraldine had a head injury which had bled at the scene, and her blood was on her own clothing, but also on Pauline's clothing. Both girls also had wax blocks of their tissues from the post-mortem, which would routinely take samples of body tissue and preserve it to look for natural disease and so forth. So we had those samples, but we also had the girls' families. We got DNA samples from all of those, and we were able to generate each individual girl's profile. We then moved on to the Sandra Newton case. And as with the two girls, we had to generate a profile for Sandra from her post-mortem wax tissue and her mother's DNA. She'd been strangled with her own skirt and left in a culvert under an old railway line. At that stage, it was simply the next case that South Wales Police wanted to look at.
And they hadn't connected the two?
They hadn't connected the two cases. Her boyfriend was a strong suspect. They didn't have the evidence to charge him. And the process there was to examine the semen stains on her. We did that. We produced a profile. Again, it was a mixture. To our surprise, we found not just the boyfriend, but an additional male profile. And because I was working on a monthly basis with the Llandarcy girls, Geraldine and Pauline, I recognised straight away that this was the same offender. This was an absolute bombshell. We were gobsmacked, because here was a connection that we could make, and this would probably turn the case on its head, which it did.
And what was the response from Paul Bethel?
Well, we had to have an immediate meeting then to decide the next steps. We weren't getting a match on the DNA database, so what did that mean? Had that person moved abroad? Why had he stopped offending? Was he dead, even? So how could we use this modern technology, DNA, to actually progress the case? We put our thinking caps on. We thought, well, how can we use DNA? Now, obviously, DNA is inherited. You get your DNA from your mother, your father, or you pass it on to your children. So we had DNA that we could use to find the family, but how could we do it? And so we came up with the idea of we could look at the local DNA, the local South Wales area, because this was obviously someone with local knowledge, given where the girls were found. We were lucky that the offender's profile had a rare component to it. We were able to narrow it down to about between 80 and 90 profiles. There were 9 profiles that matched the very rare component, and about 80 matching the other half of that particular component. We gave those names to the police, and one of the officers immediately recognised the surname Kappen as being that of Joe Kappen, who was in their so-called dead box. He was one of the deceased people, and they were working out how they were going to be able to get a sample to eliminate him from the inquiry.
I'm heading back to see Paul Bethel to find out how the profiles that Dr. Colin Dark had created would lead the police, quite literally, to the door of Joseph Kappen. You had 3 profiles of the girls. You knew that it was the same man because the particular DNA had been extracted. And you knew that Kappen was dead. And so what was the next stage then?
Kappen had died in 1990. Well, of course, as we know, the National DNA Database didn't commence till 1996. We knew that the killer's profile was not matching from running the sample on the National Database, but of course, because he died in 1990, six years prior to the commencement of the database, he wouldn't be on there anyway. But when Colin looked at the profile, he noticed that there were 2 unusual alleles, 1 or 2 chromosomes in the 20-band profile. And he came up with the idea of searching the DNA database for individuals who would be on there whose profile could contain or might contain the two unusual alleles. Now, wonderful as it sounds, it didn't mean obviously they could not be the killer, but they may be the brother, uncle, sister, etc., nephew, whatever, of the killer. But that would mean researching their family background in order to find out who the father, uncle was. Well, that was huge work in itself. That was 350 people multiplied by 10 investigations, 10 inquiries. Well, of course, Jonathan, being a scientist as they are, he came back to me the following day, and he'd been thinking of it overnight, and he suggested that what if we postcode the two alleles, postcode the Neath, Port Talbot area, and search the national database for anyone within the locality of the murder scenes and see who's residing within that locality that may have these two unusual alleles within their profile. That brought back a list the following day of 13 people. As the list was coming through, we were all rather excited to see who might be on the list. And of course, one of the list was a young man by the name of Paul Kappen.
With this information to hand, Paul and his team of detectives set about finding Kappen's son so a DNA test could be made. At the same time, more information started to come through about Joseph Kappen, the man, and it would set further alarm bells ringing. As a nightclub bouncer, familiar at the club scene, Kappen had a reputation as a ladies' man with a violent temper. I head back to see Phil, now brought on as an integral part of the review team. 30 years after he investigated the crime, he once again had Kappen in his sights, and it wasn't long until his detailed inquiries led to him building a picture of a man who became a monster.
So the next time that you hear about Kappen's name, because he's in your dead box, when's that?
It was some weeks later. DS Bethel at the time called us in and said that there was a possible match with the son of Joseph Kappen, which was a Paul Kappen.
What did you feel like when you got that news?
This was a giant step forward for us in the investigation. We then started to do some speaking to some associates of Kappen.
What were they telling you about him?
The main thing that we established was that he was a loner. He was somebody who was in complete control of what he was doing. He was a regular darts player. He played for a number of local pubs. We spoke to team members, and what they said was that he would drink, but always in moderation. He was somebody who'd worked as a bouncer at various nightclubs because he was a big guy. He was about 6'2", 6'3". He most certainly had an interest in young girls. He carried a knife. He worked on with a local bus company, so we would most certainly have travelled along the area where the young girls lived. So more and more we looked into Kappen, he became more of a suspect.
Was there any indication from the people that you spoke to that he was a man that people were frightened of, or he had violent tendencies?
He was somebody who ruled his house with a rod of iron. His first wife, he confirmed that there was a lot of abuse, physical and mental abuse going on in the house. There was a lot of physicality towards the children. On one occasion, one of the children told us that the father had taken them for a walk along the beachfront in Port Talbot, and they had an old greyhound. So in front of the two children, he put a wire cable around the neck of the dog and strangled the dog. There was another instance where the two children had taken 2 Jaffa cakes from a biscuit tin in the house. He became aware of this, and because they hadn't asked if they took the biscuit, he sent them out in the pouring rain at 10 o'clock at night. Neighbours told us that the children were knocking the doors asking if they had a Jaffa cake for them to take back to the house. It wasn't the best of households.
What I still find chilling is the fact that Kappen never left his hometown. I'm intrigued to find out more about what Port Talbot was like at the time and whether it provided the perfect cover for a killer. Psychologists often refer to this as psychogeography, and Professor Mike Berry, in his work as an offender profile, is someone who has studied this field closely. What do you think the significance is when the press named him the Saturday Night Strangler?
I'm interested in the ways that killers work and what days they kill and things like that. And usually it can give you some indication of what kind of job they've got. He was targeting clearly vulnerable girls, and they would all be going out on a Friday night or a Saturday night. So in a way, his best time to kill is on a Saturday. And I suspect he would be a typical chauvinist male at that time, go out Saturday night for beers and things like that, and not have to explain to his wife or anybody where he was and what he was doing.
How was he targeting his victims?
I think clearly he had the advantage that this is an area where there isn't public transport. Women are going to hitch, because that was a common thing he did in the 70s. And he could pick up vulnerable girls simply because they can't afford a taxi, so they're going to have to hitch. They go in pairs, which is the way to do it, so they think they're safe. If a guy comes and says, "I'll give you a lift, girls," they're not going to be too fussy about the vehicle or about him. And they think, oh, there's two of them, they're safe. But we also had, at that time, in the 1970s, we had the great winter of discontent. We had miners' strikes, we had electricity power cuts. So the whole area could have been quite likely to be in darkness, which allows him to commit his offence without being seen.
And the impact of this type of crime on the community?
It's somebody local. This screams of a local man. I know we had the M4 being built, we had lots of construction staff, but when you look at where he left the bodies and how he did it, shows quite clearly he's a local man. That's the first thing you pick up. And then that raises the question of, is it somebody we know? Is it my husband, his husband, her husband, or something like that? And that would start to make people very suspicious.
And remember that it was 28 years between the time of the offences and the time of Colin Dark's fantastic work in 2001 before he was ever named. That's a long time for community to carry a bogeyman.
Yes, and a long time for them to keep looking over the shoulder thinking, is it somebody we know?
Having spoken to Mike, I'd now like to see for myself where Kappen was living at the time of the murders. Phil has agreed to meet me there and was part of the team who did house-to-house inquiries in the area. This is a huge estate we're at where Kappen lived.
When it was built, I think it was the largest housing estate in Europe. Most of the people who lived here worked in the steel company, because only a couple of miles down the road you had a steel company which possibly employed up to 10,000 people at the time in this heyday.
How do men like Kappen, who've killed 3 girls, live in plain sight in the middle of an estate?
This was a perfect place, really, wasn't it? Thousands of people living here. He was a very private individual. He was a loner. So, in fact, this was a perfect place to hide and lay low, really, wasn't it?
Way back in 1973, Kappen was in the Holmes system because he owned the white Morris 1100 and therefore would have to be seen. So when the police came to see him, I understand the car was in the drive on the bricks.
Yes, so he became not so much forensically aware, but he was aware that a tyre print of the vehicle was found at the murder scene.
Was that publicised?
Yes, it was publicised. Obviously, he became much more forensic aware of the situation he was in, and by removing those tyres and just telling the police officers that that the car had been on a ramp for a number of weeks.
And indeed was corroborated by the wife, who confirmed his alibi for that particular evening.
She gave him an alibi for everything.
And Kappen himself must have thought that he'd got away with murder. In fact, he died very young, aged 49, but in the end, criminal justice did prevail, didn't it?
Yes, and the advancements of science. Obviously, thinking back, it must be very frustrating for the police officers who, at the time, who put so many man-hours into this investigation. And myself, being a young police officer at the time, had a small part in the investigation. But at no time did I believe that 27 years down the line, somebody would come up and science would actually detect this crime.
When you approached Kappen's house in order to get the DNA samples, what were you thinking in order to give the samples?
It was a very delicate matter for the family because, there was a policeman knocking on their door saying that, your husband killed 3 girls and tell their children that their father had actually killed 3 girls. So it was a very delicate situation. We treaded very gently, but most certainly as well, we put over the emphasis that we needed to get their DNA to prove it.
And were they all willing to give it?
His ex-wife most certainly gave permission. We already had the DNA profile of his son, Paul. One of the daughters refused and the other gave her DNA sample.
27 years after the murders, the police were now closing in on Kappen. But despite having a familial DNA match, there was only one way to prove beyond any doubt that Kappen was the killer, and it involved digging even deeper. Once again, I'm going to see Dr. Colin Dark, who led the final push to help convict Kappen of his crimes. Was this the first case that ever used familial DNA?
This was the first case that was used for familial DNA. And we had the sample from his son, Paul Kappen. A bit of research was done by the officers, and they determined that Paul Kappen's mother, was alive, and there was a sister. And they volunteered to give samples, and we did a reverse paternity. We created Joe Kappen's profile as best we could from these samples, and we could see that we could not eliminate Joe Kappen as the offender.
Because of the similarities?
Because of the similarities from his son, Paul Kappen. And so the next step, we were lucky in the sense that Joe Kappen had been buried. We could get an exhumation order and then take samples from his femur and a tooth, get his profile, and then do a full comparison.
So after exhumation, the body presumably is taken to the mortuary to be examined by the pathologist?
Yes, that's right. The pathologist then takes the femur and a tooth so that we can do a duplicate sample to check each other against that. Obtained a full profile from all the sets of samples we had, compared it to the profile we had from the girls, the 3 girls. It was a full match. Case solved. It was Kappen.
Kappen might have been convicted from beyond the grave, but I'm still no closer to understanding what drove him to commit his heinous crimes. I'm hoping that Dr. Julian Boone, a man who has spent his entire life as a psychologist working with murderers, may be able to help me. What kind of man do you think kills 3 young girls in a 6-week period?
We know from his personal background that he had a long life of crime. We know that he was completely amoral, and although married, would regularly beat his wife and also force her to have sex at least twice a week against her will. And we know that he was very much entitled in his approach to society. So he would, as they say in that area, hobble. And what hobbling means, apparently, is people who just use the welfare system to the hilt rather than do any serious work. And he was a nightclub bouncer, which is always something you have to worry about when you're dealing with offenders. Because what are they in that business for? Do they like being in a strong-arming sort of position? The complete picture of him is one of psychopathic entitlement to the world owing him to just let him pursue his hedonistic desires.
And in his particular case, do you feel that it's sexually driven, motivated crime, or the murder? And sex is part of it?
I think it's a sexually motivated crime combined with 100% sense of entitlement and lack of conscience. And the strangling was just a means to an end so that the girls could no longer identify him afterwards. So God help them if they'd said something like, well, I'm going to tell Dad about you. That would have been instant death. Not because he wants to kill them or gets gratification out of it, but because he doesn't want in any way to be identified.
And it may well have been that if he drove the school bus, those girls knew exactly who he was.
Absolutely, and he wasn't driving that school bus to do good duties for the community. No way.
No, I agree with you on that one.
All of those girls of a comparable age, 15, 16, 17, would have been raped in his mind.
Again, I've been to the area in Port Talbot where Joseph Kappen lived with his first wife. And it just seems that he's kind of an ordinary man that's killed 3 young girls living amongst his community. What is it, do you think, that gives these men the arrogance just to kind of commit 3 horrendous murders and then drop back into communal living with their neighbours?
I think we're right back to psychopathy. Psychopath's stock in trade is to dupe others. And there's even a phenomenon in psychology called duping delight. They enjoy taking people in. So it would be very easy for him to be one person in his private world, but quite another in his public life. And that would just come as easy as apple pie to him. It just wouldn't be difficult for him to do, to flit like that. Deception is first nature of a psychopath.
Julian, do you think if Kappen hadn't died at 49 years of age through lung cancer, he would have continued to offend?
Yes, I do. Once they're that deeply in the saddle, with all the hallmarks that we've discussed of that particular crime, I have absolutely no doubt that he would have continued.
Kappen's reign of terror destroyed the lives of his victims and of their loved ones. The effect of his crimes are still felt in the community, even to this day. Crimes which could only be solved through fantastic police work and forensics. Some of the best I've ever seen.
In the Joseph Kappen case, here was a man who murdered 3 young girls within 6 weeks of each other in South Wales. And the police retained the DNA evidence. And because of the evolution of DNA, they decided to look at the DNA profiles because they had good continuity of preservation of evidence with DNA. Joseph Kappen by then was dead. They ran a familial DNA. Up comes his son. Joseph Kappen's body is exhumed, a full DNA profile taken from the body, which matched the DNA evidence for the murders of 3 young girls. That is phenomenal. 27 years later.
But every murder investigation begins with the discovery of the victim's body. And I think it's only fitting that my journey re-investigating this case should end with my meeting Paul and Phil at the site where Sandra and Geraldine lost their lives. We're about to return to the woods in Llandarcy, high in the hills above Port Talbot, the place that became Joseph Kappen's killing ground. What does it feel like for both of you to come back to the scene all these years later?
Well, you can imagine being here, as we've done. Phil and I came back at the exact time, approximately 2:10 in the morning, some years ago. It was a moonlit night, the night the girls were killed. It was an extremely eerie scene. Darkness here, the isolation of it off the main road. So you can imagine how they must have felt. They must have been absolutely terrified.
How do we know how Pauline was killed?
Well, Pauline was lying at the top end of the copse, about 50-odd feet away from here, and Geraldine was just here, where we're standing at the moment. So the girls were separate. Now, in the middle of the 2 girls, Geraldine's coat had been dropped. We know it was Geraldine's coat, and it was lying right in the middle of the copse here, and alongside the coat was a footprint. And that footprint was recovered by the scenes of crime officers of the day, and subsequently that was to match Kappen's footwear and his size, etc. So what it looks like is that from the picture, it appears that he's attacked them at the top end, he's threatened them with a weapon, he's raped both girls, he's then strangled them, but at some point, Geraldine appears to have woken up, come back to life, as it were, and has run out of the copse to try and escape him, and she's got as far as here, But he's caught Geraldine down here, pulled her back onto a clump of trees, and then he's strangled and raped her here.
How do you feel about this scene, Phil, revisiting?
Well, exactly the same as Paul, really. You know, we're talking about young girls, 16 years of age, obviously just starting out in life. You know, I couldn't think of anywhere worse for such a horrific crime to take place.
And the second body of Geraldine was found when?
Geraldine was found within a short time, minutes later, and what had happened, the sergeant instructed the constable to get back down onto the main road here to protect the scene. And when the constable came down to the main road, he just glanced to his right, and of course Geraldine was wearing quite distinguished white plastic kinky boots, they used to call them in the 70s, which stood out, and you could see her legs sticking out over the top of the small hump here. So, of course, he came across, he noticed there was another girl here, another body, and the horror of the whole thing became apparent, and they realised then there were two victims.
I think when you come back to scenes of crime where they lay, it just brings it all home about the horror and sadness and anguish that they must have felt.
The memories come flooding back to you, you know, the terror of it all, you can feel it here. It's like it happened yesterday. You know, 20, 30 years means nothing. The scene is exactly as it was all those years ago, it hasn't changed.
Kappen was never tried for the murder because he died prematurely, but at least justice was done, and that the three girls who were murdered by him, there is a closure in the sense that there are 3 detected murders, not 3 undetected murders. This is a case that was eventually solved by extremely experienced detectives who, through dedication and tenacity, combined with good old-fashioned police work with cutting-edge advances in technology. But before I leave Port Talbot, I'm heading back to see Paul Bethel because I want him to have the last word.
I've always had a great problem with the word closure from my experience. And the simple reason is that I myself made a huge mistake during the course of Operation Magnum. And when we found Kappen, of course, the first thing I had to do was go to see the families and tell them that we had this result from the post-mortem examination and that 100% we were satisfied that he was the killer of their daughters. And I can remember walking up the garden paths, and in particular with Geraldine's parents, and thinking that they were going to be pleased and that they were going to be satisfied that this now matter was over and put to rest. And in fact, a dreadful thing happened when I told them. Denver grabbed my hand, Geraldine's father, and wouldn't let it go and started screaming her name and crying, and the mother began crying. And I can remember the blood draining from my body as I was talking to them and realised that this moment was the worst moment of their lives. And there was no pleasure, there was no satisfaction at all. They were absolutely devastated. There is never closure. There is some sort of solace. You might get solace from finding out who's done what, if you've been raped or your daughter's been raped or murdered, but you never, ever have closure. It stays with you till the day you die.
And what he has to say is a sobering reminder that no matter how long you've been on the job, you always have something new to learn when it comes to investigating murder.